Florence in late spring was a city that belonged to lovers, even to those who walked its streets alone. The air was heavy with the scent of blooming jasmine. The cobblestones still carried the warmth of the day's sun, and the golden reflections on the surface of the Arno seemed to whisper secrets from centuries past. Beneath the arches of history and beauty, two solitary souls were about to find themselves drawn together by chance, though neither of them yet knew it. Elena Rossi had always lived with one foot in the present and the other buried in the past. At 27, she had made a quiet career as a restorer of Renaissance paintings. Her hands, delicate and precise, carried the patience of someone who had grown accustomed to working with fragile things. Every brushstroke she repaired, every faded color she revived, felt like an act of devotion, though she sometimes wondered if her devotion to lost art came from her fear of living too fully in her own life. Once, she had believed in love, in its fire and permanence, but betrayal had left scars invisible to the eye, and Elena had chosen silence over risk. She walked the city like a graceful shadow, admired but untouchable, never allowing anyone close enough to awaken what had long been buried. Adrian Hale, in contrast, arrived in Florence carrying both curiosity and grief. At 32, he was a writer and journalist, searching not for stories of politics or economy, but for traces of meaning that ordinary people left behind. His father, who had died only months before, had once studied in this very city. Florence was Adrian's way of retracing his father's youth, of trying to hold on to something that death had already taken from him. He told himself it was research, a professional journey, but beneath that explanation lay an emptiness he had yet to face. He wandered the streets with notebooks half filled, his camera hanging loosely from his neck, as though waiting for something to happen, something to stir him back into the rhythm of life. It was during one such evening, after a sudden spring rain, that their paths first crossed. Elena left her studio later than she intended, her umbrella tilted against the dripping eaves, while Adrian hurried across the piazza, his shoes splashing in shallow puddles. Their collision was almost comical, books slipping from his hands, Elena's umbrella clattering against stone. Yet in that instant of disarray, a stillness entered the world, as though the city itself paused to take notice. Neither spoke beyond the polite words strangers exchange, yet each walked away with a lingering awareness of the other. For Elena, it was the peculiar sense that her solitude had been brushed aside by fate for just a moment. For Adrian, it was the impression of her eyes, dark, steady, but carrying a melancholy he could not name. That night, as Florence sank into silence, they each stood at different places along the riverbank. Elena leaned on the railing of the bridge she crossed each evening, while Adrian stopped farther down, his notebook unopened in his hand. They looked at the same reflections dancing on the water, unaware of each other's presence, unaware that their lives had already shifted. The story had begun, though neither of them yet realized it. Days passed, and Florence moved in its usual rhythm, though for both Elena and Adrian, there was now a faint, unspoken disturbance in that rhythm. For Elena, it was the memory of the stranger whose presence had seemed like an echo she could not silence. She returned to her work, as always, spending long hours bent over faded canvases in the cool hush of the restoration studio. Yet more than once, she found her thoughts drifting away from the pigments beneath her brush toward the image of a tall man with rain-damp hair and eyes the color of clear skies after a storm. She told herself it was nothing, a fleeting impression. But impressions, she knew from art, had the power to linger long after their moment had passed. For Adrian, Florence began to take on new dimensions. His original purpose had been his father's memory, and in his notes he still scribbled fragments of letters and observations for the article he intended to write. But in the quiet corridors of the Uffizi Gallery, while wandering among the masterpieces that had once enchanted his father, he saw her again. Elena was there, her profile illuminated by a shaft of pale morning light as she studied a painting with the intensity of someone seeking hidden truths. Adrian did not approach her at first. He simply observed, sensing in her a gravity that made the crowded gallery fall away. She was not just another face in Florence. She seemed to belong to the city itself, a part of its soul. Their paths began to cross with unexpected regularity after that. Sometimes it was on a busy street when she left work, sometimes at the cafe near the river where Adrian often sat to write. Though no arrangement was ever made, their encounters began to feel almost inevitable, as though Florence itself conspired to place them within sight of one another. Each meeting left a trace, a subtle current neither of them could resist. For Elena, these moments stirred both comfort and unease. She had trained herself to live within walls built out of caution, to avoid the chaos that desire once brought into her life. Yet with each glance, with each accidental nearness, those walls began to feel less certain. She wondered if she was being reckless, even in allowing her curiosity to grow. And yet, beneath that hesitation, her heart quickened in ways she had not felt in years. Adrian, for his part, found Florence transforming around him. The city no longer seemed a monument to the past or a backdrop for his grief. It became alive in the present. The murmur of fountains, the aroma of roasted coffee drifting from cafes, the glittering lights upon the Arno at dusk, all of it felt sharper, brighter, because of her presence in it. He had not intended to find anything beyond memory here, but memory was beginning to give way to possibility. The days unfolded gently, building a rhythm that neither of them fully recognized as the beginning of something greater. Yet beneath the surface of these quiet meetings lay questions unspoken, feelings unnamed, and a tension that grew with every stolen glance. And as the sun set over Florence, painting the city in shades of rose and gold, both Elena and Adrian felt it, the unmistakable awareness that their paths were no longer running parallel, but had begun to intertwine. The current was pulling them closer, though the destination remained hidden. Florence in early autumn held a certain melancholy, as though the air itself carried whispers of change. The tourists thinned, the heat softened, and evenings stretched into longer shadows across the piazzas. Elena felt the season in her bones, the familiar ache of endings, but also the fragile spark of beginnings. With Adrian, the encounters had grown too frequent to dismiss as coincidence, yet neither of them ever named what was quietly forming between them. For Elena, the uncertainty pressed against her carefully built defenses. She noticed herself anticipating the places where he might appear, scanning the cafe window before stepping inside, or pausing just a little longer on the bridge at dusk in case his figure emerged from the crowd. This awareness unsettled her. She had promised herself, after her last heartbreak, that she would not surrender so easily again. But the human heart rarely honors such vows. Adrian wrestled with his own contradictions. His time in Florence had always carried a deadline. Soon he would need to return to London, to the life and responsibilities waiting there. He told himself not to become entangled, that grief had already left his heart unsteady. Yet when he thought of Florence, it was no longer the city of art and history alone. It was the city where Elena's quiet presence had begun to shift the gravity of his days. He found himself writing less about his father and more about fleeting moments. The curve of her hand as she held a coffee cup, the furrow of concentration on her brow when she read, the faint smile that seemed to escape her control. Neither of them admitted it aloud, but each felt the same fragile thread binding them closer with every passing day. It was not yet love, not fully, but something dangerous in its potential, like standing at the edge of a painting still unfinished, knowing the next brushstroke could change everything. The city around them seemed to know. The bells of Santa Croce echoed differently. The lamplight on the Arno shimmered with more insistence. The air carried a quiet urgency. Florence had always belonged to lovers, its stones worn smooth by centuries of confessions and stolen kisses. And now, as September deepened, it waited for theirs. Elena tried to push the thought away, but one truth clung to her. If she allowed this to grow, it could either heal the silence inside her or break her more completely than before. Adrian, too, carried his own fear, not of love itself, but of what it demanded: permanence, surrender, the possibility of pain. And yet, in the hush of the city nights, when memory blurred with desire, he wondered if Florence had given him more than he had ever expected to find. The unspoken grew heavier between them, pressing closer with every step, until silence itself began to feel like a promise waiting to be broken. The rain returned to Florence one evening, steady and insistent, washing the narrow streets in silver. Elena lingered at the doorway of the cafe near the river, waiting for the downpour to ease. The night was cool, the kind that carried the scent of wet stone and wood smoke. She pulled her coat tighter, debating whether to risk the sprint across the square, when a familiar figure stepped into view. Adrian was already drenched, his hair plastered to his forehead, his coat darkened by water. He spotted her instantly. Something in his expression, relief, perhaps, or recognition, struck her so deeply she forgot for a moment to breathe. Without hesitation, he moved toward her, the rain falling harder, as if the city itself conspired to drive them into the same shelter. They ended up inside, the cafe nearly empty except for a few late drinkers. The windows fogged quickly, muting the world outside. They sat opposite one another at a small table, steam rising from the cups of coffee placed before them. The air hummed with a silence that felt denser than words. For the first time, neither tried to pretend their meetings were chance. Their eyes lingered too long. Their gestures carried weight. Elena studied the way his fingers traced absent patterns against the porcelain, the way his gaze searched hers as if he were afraid of missing something essential. Adrian, in turn, noticed the faint tremor in her hands, the way she seemed torn between caution and surrender. In that suspended moment, the truth they had both avoided revealed itself. This was no longer a passing acquaintance, no longer a fragile coincidence of paths. Something had begun, and it demanded to be acknowledged. Elena felt the wall she had so carefully constructed falter. Fear curled inside her, sharp and familiar, whispering that she should retreat before the ground gave way beneath her feet. Yet beneath the fear was a surge of something she had nearly forgotten, the dangerous, luminous thrill of possibility. Adrian sensed it too, though his hesitation was different. He thought of London, of the life that waited beyond this city, of the temporary nature of his stay. To move closer now would mean tying himself to something uncertain, risking the inevitable ache of leaving. And yet, as he watched Elena in the warm glow of the cafe, he knew with unsettling clarity that the risk had already been taken. The rain outside softened into a whisper, and Florence seemed to hold its breath. Their silence stretched, fragile but electric, until it was clear that one of them would have to break it, or live forever with the weight of what might have been. The turning point had come. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time they left the cafe, yet neither Elena nor Adrian hurried into the night. The streets glistened beneath the lamplight, their footsteps softened by the damp stones. Florence seemed quieter than usual, as though the city itself withdrew to grant them privacy. They walked side by side along the river, speaking little. Words felt unnecessary, too fragile for the weight pressing in on both of them. Instead, there was the rhythm of their steps, the nearness of their shoulders, the faint brush of his hand against hers every so often, accidental, yet not entirely so. Elena's heart pounded with a restless urgency. Each accidental touch felt like a question she was too afraid to answer. She told herself to keep walking, to let the silence carry them safely back into their separate worlds. But deep inside, another voice, softer yet stronger, urged her to stop hiding. She had been silent for too long, burying her longing beneath caution. And now, with Adrian beside her, silence had become unbearable. Adrian felt the same tightening pull. The river reflected the lights of the bridges, scattering them into golden fragments. And in that fractured glow, he realized how fragile time was. He could leave Florence in weeks, perhaps days, and this moment, this chance, might never return. His pulse quickened as the thought rooted deeper. To do nothing would be the greater risk. They paused on the Ponte Vecchio, the air cool and smelling faintly of wet stone. The river shimmered beneath them, restless, alive. For a heartbeat, they stood in stillness, each waiting for the other to move, to speak, to break the unbearable quiet. It was Elena who shifted first. Her hand, hesitant yet deliberate, reached for his. The contact was slight, a simple intertwining of fingers, but the effect was seismic. Every wall she had built cracked in that single gesture, every fear and hesitation momentarily silenced by the undeniable truth of touch. Adrian's response was immediate. His grip closed gently but firmly around hers, as though anchoring them both against the flood of uncertainty. No words were exchanged, yet everything was spoken in that fragile joining. Longing, surrender, the first quiet promise of something greater. The city seemed to exhale around them. The rain ceased altogether, leaving only the whisper of the river and the faint glow of lamps. For the first time, the unspoken between them was no longer a wait, but a beginning. The silence had shattered, and in its place, something dangerous and beautiful had taken root. After that night on the bridge, something shifted between them, subtle yet irreversible. Their encounters no longer carried the pretense of coincidence. When Elena walked into the cafe, Adrian was already there, waiting with a second cup of coffee at his side. When he lingered in the Uffizi, she found herself beside him, studying the same painting until the silence grew warm rather than heavy. What had once been accidental became chosen, and with each choice, the thread between them tightened. Elena felt both exhilarated and unsteady. She caught herself smiling without reason, humming softly as she worked, noticing the colors of the world more vividly than before. Yet beneath that brightness lay unease. She had been here once, in the fragile first bloom of intimacy, only to watch it wither into loss. She told herself to be careful, to temper the quickening of her heart. But when Adrian looked at her, really looked, as though he saw not just her presence, but her very essence, caution became almost impossible. For Adrian, Florence had transformed entirely. The city no longer echoed only with his father's memory. It now pulsed with Elena's laughter, her silences, her hesitant but growing trust. He found himself writing less in his notebook, not because words failed him, but because he feared capturing her in sentences would diminish the living truth of her. And yet, in quieter moments, doubt haunted him. His time was still finite. London waited, with its demands and expectations, and he wondered what right he had to draw Elena into something that might fracture when he left. Despite the shadows of fear, they leaned closer, step by cautious step. One evening, he walked her home, and though the farewell at her doorway was brief, the lingering pause before parting felt heavier than any embrace. Another afternoon, she invited him into her studio, showing him the paintings she was restoring, letting him glimpse the delicate patience of her world. He watched her fingers move with such care over cracked pigments, and he thought, not for the first time, that she treated her own heart with the same reverence, fragile, breakable, yet worth every effort to preserve. And so, slowly, surrender began, not in declarations, not in dramatic gestures, but in the accumulation of small intimacies, a hand brushing against another, a laugh shared too quickly, a silence that no longer demanded filling. Florence, with its ancient stones and eternal beauty, bore witness to the fragile miracle unfolding in its streets. They had not yet spoken of love, but the city knew, and deep within so did they. The weeks slipped by, carrying them further into autumn. The leaves along the Arno burned gold and rust, drifting into the water like slow embers. Elena and Adrian lived in the fragile beauty of borrowed time, though neither dared to speak of its limits. Their closeness had deepened, not into grand declarations, but into a quiet certainty, the kind that made every glance and touch feel like a thread woven into something larger than themselves. But time, relentless and unmoved, could not be ignored. Adrian's departure drew near. London waited with its obligations, its steady insistence that he return. He tried to push the thought aside, losing himself in Florence's narrow streets, in evenings at Elena's side, in the warmth of moments too brief to hold. Yet the truth pressed against him like a tide. Elena felt it too. She had learned to read the silences between them, and in his quiet pauses she sensed the shadow of farewell. Fear curled in her chest, not of him leaving, for she had always known this day would come, but of what it would mean once he was gone. She had dared to open her heart, to trust again, and now she faced the inevitable ache of loss. Their final evening came with startling simplicity. They walked once more to the Ponte Vecchio, the same place where everything had first shifted. The river shimmered beneath them, carrying the city's lights downstream. Neither spoke at first. There was no need. The silence was no longer heavy, but full, carrying everything they had shared. At last, Adrian turned to her. His eyes held both sorrow and something brighter, something that outshone even grief. He did not promise what could not be promised. He did not speak of forever. Instead, he pressed her hand into his, and in that touch was all the truth he could give. That she had changed him, that Florence would never again be only a city of memory, that her presence would linger in him beyond distance, beyond time. Elena met his gaze and understood. Love was not always measured in permanence. Sometimes it was in the courage to feel, even knowing the ending was inevitable. She had opened her heart, and though it ached, it also felt alive, more alive than it had in years. They parted with no dramatic farewell, only a quiet embrace that seemed to fuse grief and gratitude into one. The next morning, Adrian was gone, his absence as sharp as the autumn air. And yet, as Elena crossed the bridge alone, the city looked different. The colors seemed brighter, the silence less heavy. Love had not stayed, but it had left its mark, a restoration not of old canvases, but of her own heart. Florence, eternal witness, carried their story in its stones, another thread woven into its endless tapestry of love and loss. And though it had ended, something within her had finally begun.